Years ago, I was sitting on a train, and it was quiet, fairly empty. And then at this one stop, a bunch of people got on, and as they were all inching towards their seats, I glanced up and did a double take and exclaimed, "You're Dr. Villanur S. Ramachandran." And the guy was like, yes, I am. He seemed a little bit surprised to be recognized. This was before he had spoken at TED and published bestsellers and been featured in documentaries. Now, I had stumbled across his work due to a BBC radio lecture series in 2013 or something. Dr. Ramachandran is a neuroscientist, and I think he asked me if I was a student at the university where he does research. And I'm like, no, I'm a programmer. And then I blurted out, I live with a synesthete. And then the encounter was over. Now, this is somewhat less of a non sequitur than it perhaps sounds like. Ramachandran did groundbreaking work on synesthesia, which is a little bit of neural cross-wiring. For someone with synesthesia, a sensory receptor will be activated. The signal will travel to the brain where it triggers a sensory perception, and there it will bleed over into a nearby part of the brain, which triggers a secondary sensory perception. So they might activate a pain receptor and feel pain, and it might also cause them to hear a certain tone, or they'll hear a sound and it might have visual texture or have some particular taste. And one of my classmates at university always organized everything on her desk in pairs because 2 is such a cheerful, cuddly number. She didn't like 3 at all. 3 is really dreary, apparently. So this secondary perception is very stable over time. And some people with synesthesia can use this extra layer of perception to help orient themselves. One woman I read about knew that it's time to see the dentist when her toothache turns orange. There's an Australian opera singer whose synesthesia gives her an extraordinarily detailed memory for sounds. Her name is Priscilla Dunstan. And a few years ago, Dunstan had a baby. Those first few weeks and months can be incredibly tough. You're hopelessly sleep deprived, the baby cries, you have no idea how to fix it, you feel helpless and isolated, and people promise that you, as a parent, will start recognizing the different cries. But Dunstan, despite her extraordinary memory for sounds, wasn't hearing it. And finally, one desperate morning, she started keeping a detailed log of all of her baby's cries. And slowly, she came to the realization that there was no distinction. A cry is just a cry. But there were specific sounds that happened at the very beginning of a cry. And as she listened and experimented, that pre-cry fussiness sounded more and more distinct. "I'm hungry" was very different from "I have gastrointestinal discomfort." In time, she reliably assigned meanings to 5 different pre-cry sounds that her son made. And eventually, she started getting out of the house more, where other babies were hungry and tired and needed to be burped. And to her astonishment, they seemed to be expressing this in ways that were remarkably similar. She was hearing it, and others were not. When we talk about expertise and mastery, we tend to talk about knowing facts and being able to explicitly verbalize concepts, being able to execute specific sequences of steps. One of the characters in the Kingkiller Chronicles observes that playing music is a lot like telling a joke. Right? Anyone can remember the words, anyone can repeat it, but making someone laugh requires more than that. Telling a joke faster doesn't make it funnier. An expert isn't just a faster novice. Right? Experts seem to have this magical thing, and we call it insight, judgment, intuition, brilliance. They got that way because of some unarticulated range of experiences, practice perhaps, or seasoning, the enigmatic passage of time. In an experiment, researchers gave terrain analysts 2 minutes to look at an aerial photograph. Now, 2 minutes is not a lot. It typically takes hours to do an analysis. After 2 minutes, one of the engineers started his debrief with an offhand comment that whoever got sent to the area needed to be prepared for certain types of bacterial infections. And the researcher was like, what, you can see bacteria on a picture taken from 40,000 feet? And the engineer was like, well, the photo showed a tropical climate, and the vegetation was mature and uniform, so the contour to the top of the tree canopy reflected the underlying soil, and since the soil layer would be relatively thin, the contour to the tree canopy reflected the underlying bedrock, which appeared to be tilted interbedded limestone, and the bedrock determined the patterns to the streams and the ponds, and there was a stream that didn't have a major distributary running away from it. So given the climate and the vegetation and the stagnant water, the presence of bacteria was a sure bet. Experts have a hard time explaining what they do or how they know. They just know. Their skill is consistent and reliable and kind of mysterious. So if you can't explain it, and you don't even necessarily know what it is, how do you teach it? How do you teach seasoning and perspicacity and judgment? How do you teach intuition? In Japan, at the turn of the previous century, there were people who could look at a day-old chick and determine whether it was male or female. Now, this might seem neither important nor particularly impressive, but it led to massive price reductions worldwide, because unless you can tell whether a chick is a boy chick or a girl chick, you will spend 6 weeks feeding boy chickens. And discover only afterwards that they are of no use to you. Boy chickens are apparently, they're smaller, their meat is stringier, they don't lay eggs, and I'm told they're also troublemakers. This gets expensive at an industrial scale. So the Japanese founded a school in the 1920s to train new chick sexers. And the thing is, most of the time, chick sexers literally could not tell you how they knew. Most of the time, they were incapable of pointing out any particular diagnostic structure that they relied on to make this determination. So the training consisted of pairing up a novice with an expert and then having the novice guess, male or female, and the expert would tell them yes or no for 2 years. After that point, the newly graduated chick sexer was sexing up to 1,200 chicks per hour with an accuracy rate of 97%, all without being able to describe how they knew. Traditionally, we're really good at training the deliberate part of the brain. We write tutorials and coursework. We devise drills and practice problems. We assign homework. We're not so good at training the automatic part of the brain. We're exposed to all of these chaotic signals our whole lives, and the brain just kind of picks through it and figures stuff out implicitly. Now, it turns out there's an entire field of psychology that's dedicated to understanding the conditions under which the brain figures this stuff out. And it all started in the 1960s with a researcher named Eleanor Gibson. She designed this experiment that illustrated unambiguously the fundamental building blocks of our ability to develop accurate snap judgments. She'd start by showing a research subject a completely meaningless squiggle. And then she explained that she would show them a series of squiggles, and would they please identify all of the squiggles that matched this reference squiggle exactly. and then she'd flip through them one by one, and the research subject would make their guesses. And she didn't give them any feedback at all. After they'd gotten through the entire deck, she'd start over. This is the reference squiggle. Identify the squiggles that match. Still no feedback. By the third time through, the research subject would have correctly identified every single target squiggle. Their brain was discovering different meaningful squiggle dimensions. As they were shown the squiggles, they'd suddenly notice that some squiggles went one way, whereas others went the other way. A squiggle might have 3 or 4 or 5 spirals, and the overall shape of the squiggles varied. Some were round and some were kind of squished. Our brains are constantly going through this process of differentiation, figuring out which characteristics matter and which don't. And as the brain discovers which dimensions are important, it starts paying closer attention to those dimensions. And as we pay closer attention, our brains begin to make finer discriminations. Our perceptual resolution increases. Photographers gain a richer experience of light. Musicians gain a richer experience of sound. Industrial tasters gain the ability to evaluate mayonnaise across 14 different dimensions of flavor. This field of study is called perceptual learning, and it explores the specific ways in which the perception of experts differs from that of novices. There is a fundamental difference between how the brains of novices and experts extract information. For example, novice drummers sight-read rhythms note by note. They think about rhythms in terms of how long each note lasts. Experienced drummers don't read note for note, they read beat for beat. They think about beats as a distinct rhythmic figure, one coherent idea. And there aren't really all that many different rhythmic configurations that occur on a single beat. So over time, drummers begin to recognize the figures at a glance. Novices see a lot of low-level pieces of data, whereas experts see chunks and higher-order relations. When navigating an unfamiliar public transit system, we look at every surface, every sign, every blinking light, every arrow. We carefully parse and analyze, and for good luck, we cross our fingers, and we still end up taking the right train in the wrong direction, or getting off at the wrong stop, or exiting on the wrong side of the station. Over time, as we get used to traveling in the city, our brains start to attenuate a lot of the irrelevant signs and signals, and it automatically focuses in on the few cues that happen to matter. Novices pay attention to both relevant and irrelevant data. They can't help themselves, and experts often don't even notice irrelevant data. They also can't help themselves. As we gain expertise, our brains amplify relevant characteristics and attenuate or filter out completely irrelevant ones. And a lot of this happens before the signals even reach the part of the brain where we're aware of perceiving things. Both units and selectivity are about how we extract information. Another stark difference between experts and novices is how efficiently they extract information. Experienced pilots can determine aircraft attitude and situation with a bare glance at their instrument panel. And inexperienced pilots read and cross-check their instruments carefully, one instrument at a time. Novices process things serially, whereas experts have a much greater tendency to process things in parallel. Also, novices process slowly, whereas experts extract information quickly. And finally, whether you're sight-reading drum notation or navigating a public transit system or cross-checking aircraft instrument panels, novices are going to be drained after doing it, whereas for experts, the effort will hardly register at all. So that's the basic science. Discovery effects are about how we extract information. It's about patterns and filtering incoming signals. And fluency effects are about how efficiently we extract information. The reasoning of novices is slow and serial and capacity constrained, whereas the perceptual processes of experts are fast and parallel and don't drain cognitive resources. Where this gets interesting is when you take these basic ideas and then figure out how to use them to explicitly train intuition. There's a cognitive scientist named Philip Kelman who has spent the last 30 or so years exploring this question. And one of the interesting things about Kelman's work is that he's not going to train your intuition so that you're able to better differentiate the angle of the lines of on a computer screen in a research lab. He picks complex skills that address actual real-world problems. So some of his early stuff in the 1990s was inspired by the fact that every single year you have pilots that land at the wrong airports, or in the US get lost flying cross-country. Now there's a skill that pilots have, and the better they are at it, the less likely they are to get lost flying cross-country. And the skill is visual navigation. You look out the cockpit window, you eyeball the terrain, and then you look at a map and you decide if you're in the right place. Pilots are not explicitly trained for this skill. They develop it over time through experience. To test the visual navigation skills of experienced pilots, Kelman showed them 20 seconds of video taken from an airplane cockpit, and then showed them a map with 3 locations marked on it, one of which matched the video that they had been shown. The pilots spent an average of 30 seconds making their choice, and they chose the correct location about 50% of the time. In other words, they may learn this through experience. They don't necessarily always learn it particularly well. So Kelman's team then put each pilot through 3 hours worth of perceptual training, repeating these short interactive trials, 20 seconds of video, choice of 3 locations on a map. And by the end of 3 hours, the pilots were getting the right answer about 80% of the time, and they were spending less than 15 seconds making their choice. In an interesting twist, Kelman also ran the experiment with non-pilots, and after 3 hours of perceptual training, the 9 non-pilots got to 60% accuracy and a reaction time below 20 seconds. In other words, non-pilots with 3 hours of perceptual training were outperforming pilots with 2,500 hours of flight experience who did not yet have the perceptual training. Another real-world problem that Kelman and his team tackled was teaching fractions to middle schoolers. Now, we typically don't give students a very good mental model for understanding how fractions work or why they work, so students will often just kind of accept that there are rules and they seem arbitrary, and so when presented with a problem, they'll just kind of pick one and hope that it applies. Kelman's work wasn't directly aimed at teaching students to solve fraction problems. Instead, the goal was to get them to recognize the shape of 2 specific types of problems. Is it giving them the whole and asking them to find the part, or is it giving them a part and asking them to find the whole? So he designed interactive trials using problem formulations in multiple different representations, and the student's task was to recognize which of 3 problems in one representation matched the original problem statement in a different representation. And this was wildly effective. Even though the training didn't address solving actual fraction problems, students' problem-solving scores improved from 40% in the pre-trial tests to 70% after the training. And when the students were tested several months later, the scores held. This learning was permanent. Over the course of months and years, our brains sort through the noise, identifying the signals. And gradually, our instincts grow. And Dr. Kelman's work shows that not only is it possible to take this haphazard process and make it deliberate, but that in doing so, we can compress the learning that happens naturally into a much shorter amount of time. And the question that keeps me up at night is how all of this applies to programming. What is it that programmers with some particular expertise perceive that those without it don't? A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post inspired by a tweet that a friend of mine wrote. And before posting it, I showed him the code example, and he was nice. He said, you know, I like it. You have a race condition on line 26. And some people notice problems at a glance. But it goes deeper than this. For example, when reviewing code, the types of problems that people notice seem to be correlated with their degree of expertise in various areas. People with less expertise tend to notice more low-level, standalone, nitpicky problems, whereas people with more expertise tend to focus on problems that aren't necessarily in the code itself, but in the system as a whole. I saw an example of this fairly recently, where a pull request added a caching library to a code base, and one reviewer pointed out a confusing variable name, whereas another asked what metrics showed that adding caching here would even solve the problem. At GitHub, we have an enormous REST API with extraordinarily complex authorization logic. You can authenticate in a multitude of different ways in different circumstances, and crucially, we do not want to leak your private data. So we have about 1,000 integration tests that are specifically testing the authorization logic in the API layer. At one point, I noticed that these tests were making 2,500 database calls each. Now, our continuous integration system is set up with a time budget, and these tests were regularly hitting that budget, which caused CI to time out, which meant rerunning the entire test suite, which obviously takes twice as long. And this is bad enough during normal development, but during deploys, this was particularly painful. So after a bit, I submitted a patch to a test helper for this part of the code base, which reduced the database calls by 40%, which, when you think about it, is still not very good. But at least the tests were no longer hitting the time budget. And my manager joked that I had earned my whole year's salary in that one pull request. But the thing is, I was not being a 10x engineer, right? It was just pure dumb luck. I had noticed this problem while chasing down some problem that was completely unrelated. I just happened to notice this as a side effect. I don't have any wizardry when it comes to troubleshooting performance problems. People who are really good at troubleshooting performance issues seem to know instinctively what tools to reach for, when to reach for them, how and where to apply them. They'll eyeball a morass of data, thousands of lines of a profiler report, and they'll point to one thing and say, that number seems suspiciously high. How do they know? It's impossible to say, they just do. Now, one thing that I'm not too bad at is refactoring. I think every single technical talk I've done in the past 7 years has been about refactoring in some way or another. So there's clearly a lot about refactoring that I can explain. But people invariably ask me, how do you know where to begin? And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't feel like I know where to begin. I just kind of look around and then I pick a place. And that seems to work out a lot of the time. A couple years ago, a colleague and I were wrestling with this bug. It was the most maddening thing. It was consistently reproducible in production, and it was not at all reproducible locally. And we narrowed it down eventually. A particular type of record kept getting saved with the wrong value in a foreign key field. By this time, we were a little bit suspicious of the very many layers of indirection between our application and the database, because we could confirm that we were setting the right value on that foreign key field right before we saved the object, and then a moment later it would come out of the database with the wrong value, some other value, a completely unrelated value. It was always the same unrelated value. We were completely stumped. How is this unrelated thing getting involved? It made no sense whatsoever. And so in desperation, we started walking other colleagues through our problem. And one of our colleagues was like, wait, what's the ID of that unrelated thing? And we showed him. And there was a moment of silence, and he said, I recognize that number. It's like, of course he does. That's my SQL's max int. We had mistakenly defined our foreign key column as an int, and it should have been a big int. In less than 3 seconds, our problem went from being incomprehensible to being forehead-slappingly obvious. Right? In production, the table that the foreign key points to has billions of records. Of course the value would get truncated. Of course we would never see this in development. The turning point in almost any debugging story is not that someone sees what the problem is. No, they see a thing which reminds them of something that they happen to know, and they pose the right hypothesis, which leads them to try the right experiment, from which they discover the root cause. Like something triggers their spidey sense. A few years ago, I had a conversation with Sandy Metz. She's the author of Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. I had been obsessing over an exercise that asks people to generate the 99 bottles of beer song, which is deceptively simple. It has just enough algorithmic complexity to get you into a whole lot of trouble. And I was complaining to Sandy that every single solution I had seen was basically terrible. I mean, they worked, they were creative, they were fun, they solved the problem, but everyone seemed to be contorting the complexity, trying to hide it in some way or another. I told her I despaired of ever really seeing a truly good solution. I wasn't even sure there was one. And she came back a few days later with not one but 4 decent solutions. And one of them in particular had an abstraction that didn't hide the complexity, but seemed to make it go away. And I asked her, how did you know? And she was like, it was obvious. It took us 3 years to reverse engineer that instinct into a book that breaks it all down into explainable concepts. A lot of programming does have to do with explainable concepts, with knowing facts, and being able to explicitly verbalize ideas and execute specific sequences of steps. But a huge amount of programming expertise seems to be rooted in perception. It relies on this gut sense, this ability to make snap judgments, to just know. So in a fit of optimism, I've put together an amateur's guide to designing perceptual learning training materials. It's based on Kelman's work. The basic component is the brief classification episode. And by brief, I don't mean instantaneous. Like if you can puzzle something out logically and deliberately, then go ahead and give your brain the time to do so. But if not, that's fine, just guess. Your brain will figure it out eventually. Now, it's crucial that the learner make active judgments. Showing someone something and then telling them the answer is not going to be very effective. When they've made their determination, give them explicit feedback. And that's basically it, but for this to actually work, you need a really good data set. It needs to have a huge number of examples, ideally with no duplicates. The brain needs a massive amount of complex variation. And this variation should include not just the relevant features, you want to vary all of the irrelevant characteristics. The brain will detect the underlying invariants, the parts that don't change. That's the whole point of the exercise. So you need all that noise. You need those distractors. Otherwise, the brain has no way of figuring out which distinctions actually are meaningful. It'll start assigning meaning to certain irrelevant characteristics which happen to not vary enough in the data set, which is how we teach our brains to be biased. So that's the basic idea. You want short interactive trials targeting a specific perceptual skill using a huge, messy, complex data set with known answers. So If we want to apply this to the craft of programming, we need to identify the target skills to learn. And there seem to be two approaches to doing this. One is to identify a small, unambiguous taxonomy. Is the day-old chick male or is it female? Is the fraction problem asking to find the whole or find the part? Is the baby fussing because she's hungry or because she's tired? Is the data structure valid syntax or invalid syntax? Here, we're letting the brain discover for itself which diagnostic features are relevant and how they relate to the taxonomy. The other approach, which is possibly more interesting, is to find a skill that consists of a well-defined activity, such as the visual navigation that pilots do. Eyeball the terrain, identify the matching location on a map. And there is a taxonomy of sorts somewhere, but it's complex and it's not explicitly defined. The brain is left to its own devices to decide both which dimensions matter and how to categorize them. Once you understand the fundamental distinction that you're targeting, the problem is reduced to generating or curating a data set. There is some napkin math floating around that suggests that for the past 40 or so years, the number of programmers in the world has more or less doubled every 5 years. Now, another way of expressing this is that at any one time, 50% of all developers in the world have less than 5 years of experience. Now, over the course of 10 or 15 years, many of them will likely develop some perceptual expertise in some areas, but you can imagine that a huge proportion of these developers will rarely be exposed to the good patterns, the useful distinctions. The signal might forever be drowned out by the noise. Their brains won't stand a chance. And we can do better. We can deliberately compress these lessons, allowing new developers to waste less of their time wrestling with the mechanics of programming and spend more of their time solving meaningful problems. Thank you.